Everybody. For those I haven't met, my name is Ed Keith. I work for Deschutes County as the county forester, and that position is really focused on fire adapted communities, fuel reduction, defensible space, fire-wise communities, CWPPs, et cetera, et cetera. Boone Zimmerly is also on this in the meeting today, and he did help me put this together, and he may have some things to add along the way. So if he happens to jump in, he's our fire adapted communities coordinator here in Deschutes County, and works a lot with CWPPs and as well as implementing CWPPs. So for those of you that don't know where Deschutes County is, this is just a quick orientation slide here. We're smack dab in the middle of Oregon. The crest of the Cascades runs about a third of the way through the state. The county starts at the crest of the Cascades and moves to the east, so we're kind of in the rain shadow of the Cascades, fairly dry climate, frequent fire regime type forests, and one of the fastest growing counties in the country, actually, definitely in Oregon, the fastest growing county. We are growing leaps and bounds, and a lot of our communities are in the wildland urban interface or intermixed with wildland fuels, and so we do have a pretty robust effort around community wildfire protection plans. So we do have 7 community wildfire protection plans, which is probably a little bit different than a lot of you experience. I know some folks have county scale plans or larger geographic area scale plans. The way that CWPPs came about in Deschutes County was that communities really were asking for them and driving them forward. A couple of our communities started as soon as the Healthy Forest Restoration Act passed back in 2004, in writing. Basically, community leaders were, or members of communities that were community leaders were wanting these plans for a variety of reasons. One is that the abundant amount of federal lands and the expectation that if you had a community wildfire protection plan, that the federal agencies would look to those plans and start to implement work around communities that had these community wildfire protection plans, as well as using these as a vehicle to request funding through a variety of sources as well. So our sisters and our Upper Deschutes community wildfire protection plans got started pretty early. And then the rest of them kind of fell into place around those. So you can see on this slide that kind of the geographic representation. A couple of the plans actually cover areas outside the county as well, and that's because of other jurisdictional considerations, mainly fire districts that extend across county lines, and the fire districts wanting to have a plan that covered their entire fire district versus having a plan that split counties, and they would have to maintain multiple or participate in multiple community wildfire protection plans. So primarily driven by the communities in consideration with other jurisdictions. This is the geographic representation that we've come up with. We have been able to keep all our plans what I would call up to date in regards to we do revisions of these plans on a 5-year rolling basis. So with 7 plans, we are essentially always at some point in a year revising one of our plans. We happen to be revising the Sun River Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which is in the southern third of the county, in the smallest area of our community wildfire protection plans. And it's been an interesting time to be revising that, to say the least, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. So anyway, that just gives you a layout for how our boundaries lay out and a little bit of history behind our community wildfire protection plans. So the first thing I wanted to say as far as implementation goes is, we're here to really, or I'm here today kind of talking to you from the perspective of the county, but it's really, when we talk about implementation, it's really a team effort by all means. It's not the county necessarily implementing the plan. It's communities that are pursuing FireWise efforts. It's the cities as well as the county. It's the law enforcement agencies, including the county sheriff, that are helping with parts of the plan. In that case, primarily in regards to evacuation readiness and planning and evacuation routes and those sorts of things. The Oregon Department of Forestry works with a lot of private landowners, as well as the Natural Resource Conservation Service more recently is playing a more active role in CWPP implementation, as well as the fire districts, and then some kind of interesting, I guess I'd say, organizations. As an example, the High Desert Museum logo is up here, and that's a museum that's kind of a world-class museum that's just south of Bend here, but they have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 acres, and they've actually been implementing prescribed fire on the museum property pretty recently in cooperation with the Forest Service that surrounds them on a couple sides. And of course, part of that is reducing risk to the museum, but the more important part is actually having that as a place where people go to learn about natural history, and seeing that on the ground, and having that interpreted in a way that explains why we're doing some of this work has been kind of interesting as well. So anyway, just want to hit home the point that it's a lot of partners that are implementing different pieces of these plans once we sign off on them. So you might find us a little interesting in regards to how we come up with projects to implement, in that I have found that there is kind of a sliding scale of specificity in regards to how specific projects are identified in community wildfire protection plans. We are definitely on one side of that scale, which is the not very specific side. I've seen plans that go down to we want to implement this field reduction project on this particular acre. And our preference here has been to not do that. So we speak very generally, I just pulled out an example from one of our most recently signed off community wildfire protection plans that kind of outline our prioritized recommendations, and you can read those, and come to the conclusion, I think, pretty readily that those are super generic. You're not going to read those bullets and know what acres should be treated, right? But if you take this in combination with the risk assessment that we have, and then also knowing what communities are asking for work, we have been pretty successful in actually implementing work with generalized plans. One of the things that we've run into is that there's sometimes a time lag between the time that you find the funding for a project and the time that the community wildfire protection plan was written, right? So we could get down to the nitty-gritty details that John Doe landowner is ready and willing to implement, 68 acres of work in the highest priority area in the community wildfire protection plan, and 5 years later, when we go and find funding for Mr. Doe, he's no longer there. The new owners have no interest in fuel reduction and so forth. And so we tend to keep our priority areas general and our priorities pretty general, but recognize that that may not work for everybody, but just want to call that out as a strategy that we've used, so that when we do go and find funding or write grants, we can write the grant is oftentimes more specific in where it will be implemented, but it's still consistent with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Overall goals, overall priorities, and and it is addressing the risk that's identified in the risk assessment portion of the CWPP. So I've just found that kind of interesting to look at other community wildfire protection plans, that I've always found that we're definitely on the far side of the scale as far as general versus specific. So that might be an interesting topic for discussion, is what are other communities thinking in regards to how specific you might get in community wildfire protection plans, and how well that served you in getting work done on the ground, and could definitely see some benefits of being specific. But anyway, just thought I'd call that out as if you look at our community wildfire protection plans, that would definitely become evident to you. Okay, so when we talk about implementation, we need the money, right? Show me the money. Where do you get the money? So wanted to address this because I figured that some of you would be wondering. I'm sure a lot of you have some other experiences to share as well that I would be interested in learning about. But you know, it always takes money to implement these projects. So I was just going to run down some of our more common funding sources that either ourselves or Oregon Department of Forestry or other agencies have turned to for funding sources. One main one, as far as just sheer amount of dollars that's funded work over the years in Deschutes County, is actually FEMA. We have received 3 grants through FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program. Those have met with various challenges and degrees of success, but if you're looking for programs that actually have funding, FEMA actually does have some pretty significant dollar amounts that would be available. We did a multi-county FEMA grant to implement work that was identified in both our natural hazard mitigation plan, which is more important to FEMA than your CWPP. But it was multi-county. Our most recent one was actually funded for the maximum amount that they funded at least at the time, which was $3 million. So it's a fair amount of money available through FEMA's different programs. We are currently working with FEMA on their hazard mitigation grant program, or HMGP funding. We were eligible for that because of a disaster declaration that we received in 2017. And yeah, it's 2020 now, by the way, if you haven't noticed. So we are still working on getting that funding. So it takes a while to get FEMA money flowing for a variety of reasons. But they are a good source of funds for implementing this work. Another one that we've used quite frequently up until recently was the U.S. Forest Service and or BLM community assistance funds. So those are funds that a variety of people or agencies can apply for through our main source has been Forest Service, because we have more adjacency to Forest Service jurisdiction. More recently, those dollars have been, declining pretty significantly over the years, and most of those dollars now are actually all of those dollars in Oregon now are flowing directly to the Oregon Department of Forestry and other local governments, or in fact, way back when even nonprofits could apply for those, and those have all been cut out, and that funding goes directly to Oregon Department of Forestry, but still to fund the same type of work. It's just the county has not been eligible to apply for those anymore. But ODF uses those funds, and then ODF also uses the state fire managers funds for a funding source as well. So that's been pretty reliable over the years. We do, if you look at our risk in Central Oregon in comparison to the rest of the state, we have a pretty easy case to make for funding of fuels reduction. And so we've been pretty lucky to benefit from the Western State Fire Manager funds as well as community assistance funds. And then more recently, we've been delving into a few other pots of money. That includes dollars from the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Fund. And for those that haven't heard of that, if there are folks on here that haven't heard of that, that's the two chiefs, the chief of the Forest Service and the chief of the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So you have to basically demonstrate that there's some cross-boundary projects that are ready to go. They don't necessarily have to be fuels reduction. They could be multifaceted. And I'm going to talk towards the end of the presentation about our most recent Joint Chiefs. But we have received one Joint Chiefs. It was a significant amount of money. I think all partners included. That was a 3-year project that was funded to the tune of about $8 million. So we got some significant amount of work done in our the south part of our county through that, both on private lands as well as Forest Service lands. And that funding didn't just flow, interestingly for us, through to the Natural Resource Conservation Service for private lands, but we also had a funding proposal for the Oregon Department of Forestry to receive funds, as well as Deschutes County to receive funds for work on private lands, primarily focused on lands that wouldn't traditionally fit in the box that NRCS typically deals with, the larger private landowners. We had a lot of communities that were involved as well that would really not be eligible or probably be willing to do the amount of paperwork for the small amount of acreage that they had. So we came up with a project there that provided funding to multiple agencies through one proposal. And then one last funding source has actually been through county funds. Most recently, the last couple of years, we've actually been providing funds to Firewise communities for defensible space projects. And that's just been discretionary dollars that have actually flowed from the Oregon lottery to the county, and then county commissioners have prioritized assisting Firewise communities implement their action plans through this funding. And we just doled out $20,000 yesterday, actually, to Firewise communities to do defensible space projects this coming spring. So anyway, that's just kind of a rundown of where we've gotten money to do some of this implementation work. So what does the implementation work look like? We've got a few different examples here. I'm going to just start with this one, in that we have some fairly well-developed communities. This is actually a community that's right on the edge of Bend. So I believe the homes are actually in the city, and then this property that was just recently treated is actually outside the city. So wildland areas that are right next to communities that are private lands, either Deschutes County or the Oregon Department of Forestry has typically worked with this type of landowner that is, maybe a smaller forest landowner, not really, a landowner that's making money from harvesting of trees, but may pose a significant risk to the adjacent community. And we've funded things like, your typical fuel reduction, thinning, brush mowing, slash disposal, those sorts of things. So we tend to try to focus this work, again, next to communities. Some of them are more dense than others, but really trying to really address the risk that is proximate to the communities. We also work right in communities with what we would term sweat equity projects. And so these are projects that have been better suited for the county in most cases to facilitate. The Oregon Department of Forestry is a better fit for your forest land owners. But when you really get into communities that are an acre lot or less. You know, we have a lot of communities that are even in the rural county down to about a half an acre in size. You might have several hundred lots. And so what we do in this case is just essentially provide an incentive to the community to do defensible space work. So we expect the residents to actually do the work, but recognize that getting rid of this amount of vegetation is somewhat of a challenge. So we actually have used some of our funding to supply contractors to take this material, this yard debris, out of the high risk communities. So just a couple examples here of, you know, we'll quite commonly ask for people to put stuff along the curbside and or at a centralized location in the community, and then that contractor comes and either chips that material and hauls it away, or just hauls it away. And so, I mean, this is a windrow of stuff that came off of just one private property, as an example. This is a community just south of Bend on the left-hand side of the slide here. And that was, again, just I think a 2-acre property. That was a material that came off of that one property there. And so people are pretty responsive to this type of project. And it really gets down to reducing the risk and actually then teaching people about defensible space as well. So with the expectation that they do the work on their own property, it gets the whole community involved. It actually provides their investment in the project. So it's not just us necessarily coming in and supplying the contractor to do all the work. We're just trying to identify the sticking point. And a lot of times that for our communities here is, how do you get rid of this stuff? So supplying that contractor has been met with great enthusiasm with a lot of our communities. And in fact, this has actually been the starting point for actually a lot of our Firewise communities. So I think we're sitting at 38 Firewise communities, plus or minus, in Deschutes County. But when a community comes to us and says, you know, we don't know where to start, a lot of times we'll start them off with doing a sweat equity project and it gets them understanding what defensible space is, that it can still look attractive when the project's done, and that sort of thing. You know, after a project like this is done, we'll quite commonly point that community down the path of being Firewise, in the hopes that they organize these events on their own in the future, and that they fund them on their own in the future. And a lot of communities do these types of projects in the spring in advance of fire season. Now, some of them on their own, funded through HOA dues or whatnot. And then, of course, I do have to mention the work on the federal lands around our communities. So Deschutes County is approximately 2 million acres in size. 1 million acres of that is the Deschutes National Forest. So 50% of the county is managed by the National Forest. Another 25 or 6% is managed by the BLM, and 2 or 3% by the state. So federal lands are a big component of what we're talking about in our community wildfire protection plans, because federal lands touch or are proximate to a lot of our communities in Deschutes County. So what that looks like is typically thinning small trees, mowing brush, and then coming in after a couple years of that mechanical treatment and hopefully putting some fire on the ground, both for the benefit of, you know, fire reintroduction in a fire dependent ecosystem and all the benefits that brings, as well as reducing the risk to that adjacent community. And we really have tried to prioritize getting this work done next to the community. So just as an example here on this map, it's kind of a busy map, but I think it illustrates a good point. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, the Forest Service was actually probably doing a few more acres of prescribed fire, but they were doing it kind of in the, what I would call the back 40 or the hinterlands, you know, in places where smoke was not going to impact the community, that people weren't going to be alarmed or surprised when they saw that big column of smoke, but it wasn't really, you know, and it still had the benefit, of course, of reintroducing fire into the ecosystem, but it didn't have the added benefit of reducing risk to communities. And the community wildfire protection plans have really emphasized the fact that for federal lands, we want to see you start right on the boundary and work out from there. So, you know, one of our priorities is trying to encourage the federal land managers, the Forest Service and BLM to really do this work right next to the community in strategic locations, realizing that we can't treat every acre out there. So we need to be really strategic about where we treat. So anyway, this map, you can see the dots here. Those are all structures. The more densely packed structures are in the city of Bend, and then some of these outlying areas or subdivisions just outside of Bend in the rural county. And then some of the colors here are units that have been implemented with prescribed fire. So kind of that last step of fuel reduction before we kind of get to a maintenance mode, hopefully. And you can see, for example, on the southeast portion of this map, the units that wrap right around this subdivision. This was also the subdivision that I showed that was doing that sweat equity work with a big pile of slash next to the evacuation sign. So we are implementing these projects kind of on a small scale, mostly due to limitations in our air quality regulations and how much smoke we can put in the air next to a populated area like Bend, but really trying to provide a strategic location so that if fires should happen, and there are some historic fires that show here that have impacted communities, that firefighters have a safe and effective location to potentially catch that fire before it burns into the community. So that's some of the examples of implementation and what we're doing in regards to implementing fuel reduction projects and defensible space projects in a few areas in the county. Did want to mention just real briefly that implementation for us is not just about fuel reduction. We do focus on that a lot, but we also do have some other focus areas. So I just throw this up as one example of other implementation that we've been working on over the years, and that's in this example, that would be evacuation routes and evacuation signage and evacuation readiness. So Oregon uses essentially the Ready, Set, Go as our evacuation levels. We have a lot of communication and readiness programs around that. Project Wildfire also offers a sign program to communities. We have a lot of communities that are one way in, one way out, and can be confusing to get out of for people that don't live here full time. So we actually offer a signage program to help identify and sign those routes for people that may not be familiar with how to get out of particular subdivisions. And then more recently, we've actually been identifying some of our primary evacuation routes in an interactive mapping program. We're still working on that, but anyway, that's been another process that's rolled out of implementing our community wildfire protection plans. Our earlier plans called for identifying some of these routes, and more recently, I think especially due to some of the evacuation news that came out of Paradise, I think we ramped up our efforts around making sure that these evacuation routes are planned out and known by the community and can be utilized in a variety of ways. So just wanted to mention that implementation is I recognize that implementation is, for us, has been a lot focused on fuel reduction, but not exclusively focused on fuel reduction. And then I just wanted to comment that I think it's been pretty interesting lately how complicated getting funding has gotten over the years. Our community assistance grants used to be a couple pages with a map. Our most recent Joint Chiefs proposal actually includes a super in-depth story map with a huge pitch with all kinds of different link studies to justify our request. And this is one that we just, this is a project that we just put forward here this month for the most recent round of Joint Chiefs. And I can supply this link to you if you want to check it out, but it is interesting that fuels reduction has, and the competition for limited funds has definitely evolved in my time in putting forward proposals. This proposal is a $13 million proposal that involves 2 counties, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and a variety of other partners. And also doesn't just include fuels reduction, it actually includes watershed restoration and wildlife habitat enhancement as well. It's just, I just find it really interesting, the amount of work that goes into putting these proposals together to compete with that limited amount of dollars that are out there. So just thought I'd throw that out. And I think this is my last slide. So what do you do with all this implementation? Well, like I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we do revisit these plans on a 5-year rolling basis. So we do have a way to capture what is done as well. And typically what that looks like is when we reconvene our community wildfire protection plan kind of steering committee, as we would call them, that consists of all the agencies, as well as some of the more active community members. The start of that revision process, it really looks like a check-in of what did we get done over the last 5 years and how has that changed our priorities. So we do typically capture then in maps what each agency has done, on a geographic basis. And that really feeds into how we look at, where risk has been maybe was high in our on the higher end in our last community wildfire protection plan, and how those treatments may have influenced where we might be going next. So we're always kind of checking in on what we got done, where did it happen, and how's that changed where we're going to be focusing in our next 5-year version of our plan. So just wanted to close with the fact that we do try to capture this on a 5-year basis, and then re-look at where we might be needing to do implementation in the future in places that we haven't been able to get work done yet. So